In the world of video games, there is one name that stands above all others: Shigeru Miyamoto. In the pantheon of all-time masters of his craft, he is often compared to the likes of Steven Spielberg, Steve Jobs, even Leonardo da Vinci. These comparisons are remarkably fair considering the body of work he's put out into the world. From the original Donkey Kong, to Super Mario Bros. And its many sequels, The Legend of Zelda, F-Zero. He even played a significant role in guiding the development of the original Pokemon games. Each of these had become bestsellers for Nintendo and helped define not only its own consoles and offerings, but defined video games as a whole as well. Throughout the latter half of the 1990s, during the Nintendo 64 era, he had the primary focus of guiding all of these franchises into the fully 3D world of polygons. This started all the way back with Star Fox, pioneering very early 3D graphics all the way back on the Super Nintendo. But more famously with the evolutions of each of these most cherished franchises on the Nintendo 64, with Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Star Fox 64. However, guiding each of these series into the complicated world of 3D gameplay also meant that he had no time for new series. That was finally changing with the advent of the GameCube. Now that Nintendo's internal teams had thoroughly stretched their legs in the wonderful world of polygons and camera controls, and now that the notoriously difficult Nintendo 64 was being replaced by the remarkably easy-to-program GameCube, the Willy Wonka of video games could once again work on bringing a new series into the world. As with all these aforementioned projects, Shigeru Miyamoto was not the only person working at Nintendo, though. Often less known and less credited are the plethora of other designers, planners, programmers, and members of subordinate teams that Miyamoto and other producers led through the development process. In this case, our story begins with graphic designer Shigefumi Hino, who designed Yoshi for the Super Mario World series, and Masamichi Abe, a senior manager of Nintendo software technology who led the development of 1080 snowboarding before repatriating back to Nintendo Japan. This pair began collaborating on trying to come up with a new kind of game that hadn't been done before in more ways than just one. First, they wanted to utilize the increased power that came with newer hardware, at that time the Nintendo 64, in order to throw around tons of characters on screen in a way never before possible. Second, they explicitly wanted to avoid making something overly saccharine and cartoonish, as Nintendo was heavily known for then and now. But Hino was largely behind the design of the Yoshi's Island game, so some of the earliest concepts for characters certainly took after this style. These characters were originally called Adam and Eve, to delineate male and female types. They were also intended to be robotic characters with control chips that gave the player control over a large mass of them. This is when the team was joined by a fresh-faced new artist named Junji Mori. Mori took inspiration from the works of filmmaker Tim Burton, as well as the team's desire to set this game in a more alien, ecological world, and produce design sketches for little humanoid alien creatures with flowers sprouting from their heads. With this design, the team had found its character. Now it was just a question of what they were going to do with them. Since they wanted to make a game where the player controlled masses of these characters, they thought of ant colonies as an inspiration, and began to look into different sources to study the concept of Darwinism in nature, such as Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, or the surrealist French animated film, Fantastic Planet. They also needed to translate these ideas and designs into something that could actually be put on a television screen. And that's where Mr. Miyamoto entered the picture. Shigeru Miyamoto was at the time deeply involved in the design and planning of the GameCube, and was heading up a team to produce some of the tech demos that will be shown at Space World 2000. Arguably the most famous of these would be the Mario 128 demo that was made to show how many individually rendered 3D characters could be put on screen and made to do their own actions via advanced, for the time, AI techniques. This demo gave Miyamoto the idea that controlling a small army of these characters might make for a fun game. It was with this idea in his head that he came across the team working on this odd little concept for controlling ant-like creatures in an alien world. The demos he observed thus far were to him a little too much like a variation on a game like Lemmings, where the goal would be to raise a certain number of these creatures and get them to a designated goal spot at the end of a level. Instead, he thought the idea of putting the player in the position of an omniscient, godlike presence would be better, allowing players to, quote, watch the life of these little characters. The problem with this idea was that he had just been beaten to it by Will Wright's The Sims, released earlier in the year 2000, and had become a massive hit on the PC. Plus, Nintendo had actually just published its own entry in the God game genre when Doshin the Giant released alongside the stillborn Nintendo 64 disk drive in Japan in December of 1999. Still, Miyamoto thought there was something here and wanted to make something new for the GameCube, so he offered to take the helm at the head of this fledgling little team and whip this grab bag of ideas into a game. He laid out his proposal for how the gameplay would work in a 2-page document that spelled out using the mass of little characters as merely the means towards an end, such as collecting an object on the map or defeating enemies. The little characters in question were originally referred to as ipiki, which in Japanese is a word for describing a singular small animal for the purpose of counting a number of them as a herd. However, the development team would include a Westerner, Colin Reed, who came alongside Abe from Nintendo Software Technology and was the primary programmer for the game. Reed overheard ipiki and thought the Japanese team members had named the characters as Piki, which the whole team thought worked very well since they were meant to be plucked from the ground. Thus the name evolved into its formal title, Pikmin. While Miyamoto was a wellspring of ideas, it was the work of the other members of the team that made these ideas real, particularly art designers like Hino and Mori, who were busy giving the game's new world all kinds of bizarre and yet charming forms of life, both friend and foe. The game was not even afraid to go into some very un-Nintendo places, as it depicted the predatory creatures on this planet devouring the Pikmin, with them chewing on the Pikmin and swallowing them being fully articulated, including even short death screams and little ghost avatars that arise when members of your alien ant army are eaten. But in turn, the enemies you do defeat could then be carried back to your home base as a kind of trophy, which then fertilizes the creation of new Pikmin creatures, in a rough approximation of the circle of life. But the gameplay was based on more than just natural selection. It was also based in part on Miyamoto's own life and job. As he would say in later interviews, he in part got the inspiration for how the player would track and manage Pikmin across the game map from his own position as a producer and manager at Nintendo, corralling employees and assisting them in tasks across the project as needed, as well as providing direction and making decisions where needed too. With Nintendo's High Lord of Game Design at the helm, these disparate concepts were all drawn together into a cohesive gameplay concept in just a number of months, and just barely made it to Miyamoto's self-imposed deadline to have something to show at E3 2001, which was going to be the big coming-out party for the first GameCube games. In fact, Pikmin would be more than just one of the games Nintendo would show at E3. It would be the game Nintendo showed at E3, since it would be one of two surprise announcements they would make alongside Super Smash Bros. Melee during their press conference. And of the two, it garnered more headlines and attention by virtue of being the first new franchise from Nintendo in some time, and being the latest offerings from the world-famous Miyamoto. Although Smash Bros. Was more likely the fan favorite for the hardcore players, Pikmin became another of the experimental departures from the norm that Nintendo was headlining the GameCube with, similar to the sharp left turn they were making with Luigi's Mansion. Unlike most of the other games shown at E3, however, Miyamoto was making one of the biggest bluffs in his career, as the presentation of what was shown at E3 was all that existed of the game at that point, and in fact, everything shown was created just for the presentation and wouldn't even be part of the final game. While Miyamoto and Nintendo never specifically said anything about the completion state of the game, it was a tremendous sin of omission that they presented the game with all the pomp and circumstance of being a long-planned project coming to fruition, when in reality, it was a bare-bones demo that had just come together in the past 3 months. More revealingly, it was also a tremendous testament to their belief in coming up with a fun and interesting core gameplay concept before developing a game around it, and that belief appeared to pay off, since Pikmin would be one of the most acclaimed new titles to come out of E3, and was heralded as Nintendo doing it again, by making a game that appeared to be for everybody, and yet like no other game before. Although gaming journalists would do their best to describe the game as a kind of console version of a real-time strategy, or RTS game, simplified down to the point where only 2 buttons were actually needed to play it. The primary innovation in design that the game showed was, rather than giving the player a cursor to lord over the map with, like other RTS games, Pikmin appeared to make the player take on the role of the cursor itself, in the position of the astronaut character that made up the protagonist of this demo. The E3 demo would show off 3 different colors of Pikmin, a plethora of monsters that are out to devour them, the practices of collecting defeated enemies and numbered pellets to grow new Pikmin, as well as the mechanics of collecting up and throwing Pikmin. Basically the entire gameplay loop that the game had developed up to that point. The game would also be confirmed to be a launch title for the GameCube, an even larger surprise than the unveiling of the game itself. With all of these accolades and expectations now on their shoulders, Miyamoto and the Pikmin team set to work taking this concept and making a fully blown game out of it. Pikmin would see quite a bit of change between its unveiling and the final version. In fact, it would change noticeably just between E3 and its next showing when it appeared at Space World 2001. Now, the relatively empty sandbox world that had appeared at E3 was replaced by a stunningly realistic nature-filled world, with beautiful, highly detailed textures for grass, wood, and sand. It had plants swaying, and some of the most realistic water effects ever seen. Plus, there were additional creatures making appearances, and new mechanics for the Pikmin to do things like build bridges and ramps. A curious change of the mechanics also showed the spaceman needing to pluck each Pikmin out of the ground individually, rather than just using the whistle cursor to summon all of them out of the ground at once. A change Miyamoto would confirm he had the development team pull out of the game in the last 2 months of development, in order to increase the time management trade-offs of harvesting Pikmin. When showgoers got their hands on the playable demo on the Space World show floor, they also got a taste of one of the new core mechanics of the game, as the demo now featured a sun-based clock that counted down towards the end of the day, at which point the demo reset for the next attendee to try. Although they didn't get a chance to see what happened after the day ended, it made apparent that the game would be taking place under the constraint of a shortened approximation of a daytime cycle. Just after Space World, on the eve of the Japanese launch, Pikmin would quietly be delayed to shortly after the Japanese and North American launches, moving for the Japanese to the last week of November, and to December 3rd for North America. While Miyamoto had taken the team on a very short crash course to get something ready for E3, he was not going to cut corners to have the game out for any arbitrary launch date, even if it was the system's launch. This also put the game launching directly alongside Super Smash Bros. Melee, which was a result of both games getting a delay to the post-launch window, and also likely a result of Nintendo's habit of shipping titles together when they're scheduled to launch around the same time, so that they could save on shipping and distribution costs. Although again, between the 2 games, while the fanbase was clearly more enthusiastic for Super Smash Bros., Nintendo itself was putting more of its marketing muscle behind trying to promote Pikmin. The game would of course get television commercials, it would get a special promotional pamphlet just extolling the history of Shigeru Miyamoto's work and presenting Pikmin as his latest wonderful creation. Those who purchased Luigi's Mansion and were diligent enough to explore the options menu would actually find the option to watch a Pikmin movie hidden away in there. The first time Nintendo had been able to include any kind of preview for one of its upcoming games, since this was one of the first disc-based games they had shipped. But the promotions did not stop there, as Nintendo would also hire teams of performers dressed as Pikmin to run around shopping malls during the busy Christmas season, and would take the winners of a Nintendo contest on a $500 shopping spree, while also making good PR by donating $1,000 checks to local charities, such as Toys for Tots or funds for the victims of the September 11th attacks. By far, however, Nintendo of America came up with a promotion never seen before or since for a video game company to promote its product. It invented a flower. Just after the launch of the game, the company announced a partnership with the flower retailer S&G Flowers USA to release a specially cultivated variation of the fairly common Sutera cordata plant. It called this variation and trademarked it as the Bacopa Cabana. That was made to appear as close as possible to the fully bloomed head of a Pikmin in the game, and thus it was dubbed the Pikmin flower. The seeds for this special product wouldn't be available until April 2002 in order to be in line with the proper season for planting, but Nintendo of America's Peter Main would tout it as a prime example of how Nintendo was always thinking outside the box, saying, quote, "This extraordinary marketing initiative to consumers demonstrates that at the core of Nintendo is creativity." End quote. However, some 20 years later, it's a very big question mark whether this particular variation still exists, or whether it was even a genetically distinct subspecies in the first place. This is by far the most bizarre and obscure form of lost media I've ever heard of in relation to a video game. Perhaps the Pikmin flower is still out there, or maybe it's sadly extinct. I leave it to the remarkable sleuths of the lost media community out there to pick up the case from here. Good luck, and Godspeed. Turning our attention to Pikmin itself, the game opens with one of the simplest menus we've seen yet, since you have just an options menu with pretty much nothing to really set or change, and then you can start the game. You're treated to another nice in-engine intro sequence like we saw with Luigi's Mansion. Here you're observing the continuing voyages of the space explorer Captain Olimar, a simple anagram for Mario, and his ship, the Dolphin, cheekily named after the GameCube's old codename, which Miyamoto was particularly fond of and pushed to make into the system's actual retail name. A simple asteroid strike fatally damages the Dolphin, however, and the next thing he knows, Captain Olimar finds himself waking up marooned on an alien planet. Making a quick assessment of his situation, he estimates he has about 30 days worth of life support to get spaceborne again, otherwise he will surely perish. You start to explore your environment, and are quickly confounded by a red, bulbous item that transforms into a tripod and sprouts a seed that then grows into a little sprout. Plucking that sprout introduces you to your very first Pikmin, a simple little creature fused with nature as a leaf is growing from its head. Forced to improvise and experiment, Olimar starts to have the Pikmin collect the little pellets you find scattered around, which in turn produces more Pikmin and lets you move obstacles, and then find one of the missing parts of your ship, giving you the opportunity to begin exploring the planet, and the hope that you can find other parts and rescue yourself from the clutches of certain doom. The nice thing here is that on your first day in this introductory area, you notably don't have a time limit, and there are no enemies to confront you, so it's best to make sure you at least collect everything available to you before moving on to the next stage, since you won't be getting another chance like this to stop and smell the dandelions. Importantly, you won't be left to figure out all these steps on your own, as Olimar will be narrating to himself throughout this experience to relay these discoveries and primary gameplay concepts to the player, with the controller laid out on screen to hammer it all home. This kind of rolling tutorial content will continue all through the early stages of the game until everything they have to tell you has been covered. Fortunately, since the first part you found enables you to travel around, you get to move on to the second of 5 different areas in the game. Here the world becomes much more vast. Enemies are introduced, and you have the ever-impending time clock hovering at the top of the screen, counting down to nightfall. You start to make other discoveries, like the nectar that can be harvested from some tall grasses that upgrades the Pikmin from their leaf form to the pollen pods to fully blooming flowers, at which point they move the quickest. You can also achieve this effect by leaving them in the ground for a while, but that's an unadvisable use of your time rather than putting them to work. You also learn the importance of strategy in facing down enemies, as you can kill some of the smaller ones instantly with a well-placed throw of a Pikmin onto its head. And facing down the giant Bulborbs becomes a lot less deadly if you swing around the back and throw Pikmin onto its back in order to attack and distract it from munching on the ones at its feet. You also make the discovery of your second onion as Olimar takes to calling the Pikmin's home bases. This one is yellow, and introduces you to the large-eared yellow Pikmin, who you'll find can be thrown further and higher than other Pikmin, and can also handle bomb rocks, which will be needed to bring down stone walls, and can also be handy in a fight with some larger creatures. This is where you also want to start to take notice of which Pikmin you have harvesting different colored pellets, since you get an additional bonus amount of Pikmin if you bring red pellets to the red onion and yellow pellets to the yellow onion. This will be determined by the majority of Pikmin of one color you have carry something back. More yellow Pikmin doing the job means they'll take it to the yellow onion. You get the idea. As you adventure further along and explore your surroundings, you'll be confronted by all types of barriers and obstacles to figure out. New and more inventive enemies, and also parts of the dolphin that you're looking for. Between all these elements, you'll need to divide your attention, as well as your Pikmin, between collecting ship parts, working on destroying or building obstacles, and building up your numbers so you can carry increasingly larger objects and replenish those Pikmin you'll inevitably lose to battle. All this while keeping an eye on the countdown to nighttime, at which point you'll want to make sure you have all of your Pikmin either back in their home base, or at least within your group. Otherwise, they'll miss the boat when you take off for the upper atmosphere and fall victim to the creatures of the night. Once you gather a few more pieces of your ship, you're given the ability to move to a third area, but also the ability to use the map button to check the area you're in for the locations of other pieces, marked with a star. You'll even be able to notice some of these stars move around the map as the piece is located inside an enemy creature. It's an incredibly handy feature that almost makes things too easy, since the need to explore around the map is reduced tremendously, and instead you can just make a beeline for the ship part. That is, of course, once you work out the myriad of obstacles and enemies in your way. By the third world, you find the blue Pikmin, who true to their color are the water Pikmin and won't drown when they come in contact with H2O. This lets you reach a whole new bunch of areas that were previously unreachable, both in the current level as well as the previous ones. But you also have to start specializing and micromanaging your groups of Pikmin from here, since you'll need to carefully employ certain ones to accomplish certain tasks, sometimes in tandem with one another. For example, you'll start encountering fire spouts and fire-shooting enemies that the red Pikmin will be relatively immune to, while other Pikmin will get decimated by. You'll need to run the yellow Pikmin back and forth to handle the bombs to bring down walls where needed, and you'll need to have the blue ones handle any underwater business, including some water-specific enemies. You also can't leave any group of Pikmin too unsupervised unless you've already pre-cleared the path all the way back to the ship, since enemies will inevitably stumble upon them and result in a massacre, or they'll walk headlong into things like fire or water without a second thought. This is all compounded by the hard limit of only having 100 Pikmin in the field at one time, meaning you'll need to carefully consider how many you'll need for a given task. How many red Pikmin should you take out of the bank to bring down the fire-breathing enemies? How many blue Pikmin will be needed to carry back a ship part that's in the middle of a pond? How many yellow Pikmin do you think you'll need to bomb this wall down? If you screw up and make a major miscalculation, there's one big eject button, the Start from Last Save option in the pause menu. That'll let you go back and try the day again. You'll probably get well acquainted with this option if you play like a bit of a perfectionist, or if you just can't stand the thought of losing a big swath of Pikmin and moving on, like that's okay. This actually covers the whole gameplay loop. It's deceptively simple, but you'll actually run into quite a number of times where you need to just pause, save, and take a break, since being under such time pressure to manage so many things will really take it out on you mentally, as the levels and challenges get more and more complex, and sometimes unforeseen events just come bearing down and wipe you out. But essentially, all the gameplay is encompassed up to this point. Enough so that once you reach this point, you can actually unlock the one other mode of the game that was added in, the Challenge Mode. In an interview with the developers in the Nintendo Power Guide to the game, Miyamoto says that he had the team add this additional mode into the game after their E3 presentation in order to give the game some more replay value, and because it seemed like a fun use of the gameplay mechanics. In the challenge mode, you're set in one of the levels you've unlocked so far, with all 3 Pikmin types you've discovered, and are given 1 day to see how many Pikmin you can raise. It's a straightforward high-score game, but the levels are slightly rearranged with items, obstacles, and enemies in different places from the main campaign mode. But other than beating your own score, there isn't anything else to it than that. In fact, it somehow manages to be even more frantic and stressful than the campaign mode, since you know you only have a single day. Even the music acknowledges this by running at a faster tempo in this part of the game. I try not to give away the ending to any of these games, since I want to encourage folks to play them, and don't want to ruin them for someone who never has before. With Pikmin, luckily, I can't really ruin the ending since that's entirely up to you. As mentioned when you first landed, Captain Olimar has 30 days of life support to make it off the planet before he dies. A remarkably dark turn for a Nintendo game, and it's no idle threat. It's a very real possible outcome for the game. So what happens will be up to how well you can do. Although partway through the journey, Olimar will figure out that he can make do with just 25 of the possible 30 parts that you can collect. So there's some well-deserved leeway that keeps you from needing to 100% everything to finish the game. Pikmin is also a game I personally remember, as it was the third GameCube game I received on that Christmas in 2002 when I got my console. One thing I remember standing out to me then, that still stands out to me today, as I play the game again on a progressive scan HD CRT, is how amazing it looks. From the default camera scheme pitched at a 2/3 degree angle above the ground, things look remarkably realistic, like you're looking down into a sandbox garden of your own. No doubt the intention of the designers, who freely admitted to taking textures from their own gardens and surroundings in their yards and neighborhoods. I can also understand Miyamoto's stated attempt to have this camera angle enshrined as the one and only camera angle in the game. Although I don't fully agree with that idea, and I'm glad he did not win this internal debate, and thus you still reserve the ability to change the camera between different zoom modes. Although, yeah, try to keep it out of the closest zoom mode, since that's when the texture quality gets pretty muddled and the illusion of realism is lost. These textures aren't made to be looked at that close. The realistic environments are still contrasted with the more cartoonish characters though, which mostly don't feature any heavy use of textures, and instead use more Gorad shading. This is probably the saving grace of the art design that keeps the game from being unsettling or disturbing, since realistically rendered animals and creatures carrying out the attacks and deaths that go on in Pikmin would be a little too macabre, and the lighter cartoonish characters make it a still relatively cute Darwinism in action. The music also needs a shout-out, since it's nice and cozy, organic and plucky, with hints of mystery and the unknown thrown in, as you are indeed on an alien planet. But it's not up in the pantheon of Nintendo soundtracks. It's not likely that someone in public would recognize the theme to Pikmin the same way someone would recognize the Super Mario Bros. Tune, or the Legend of Zelda intro. But still, it's quality music that does its job and does it well. It just helps reinforce the quirkiness of the game. As a brand new project, and a fresh franchise, Pikmin is yet another Nintendo property that demonstrates how the company was going off the beaten path with the GameCube, and indulge in its exotic and creative tendencies like never before. The amazing thing is that they take these risks and still don't miss. The console world is littered with the shells of games that tried to adapt real-time strategy gameplay to game controllers and failed. Yet here, Nintendo's team did it on their first try, while also making it a simpler game to actually play than most, at least going by the controls. Although the complexity of the goings-on in the game would still demand the nerves and patience of an avid gamer, much to Mr. Miyamoto's likely chagrin, as he hyped the game up as something that even non-gamers could play due to the simple control scheme. A foreshadowing of where he was looking for the future. Unfortunately for Pikmin, Miyamoto's team, and those who really like it when Nintendo tries to do new things and introduce new franchises, Pikmin was pretty dramatically overshadowed by releasing in the same 24-hour window as Super Smash Bros. Melee. Although Pikmin would go on to sell over 1 million units in its lifetime worldwide, it didn't quite live up to Nintendo's efforts to make it the next big thing a la Pokemon, and it would comfortably settle into one of Nintendo's more niche cult favorite series instead. Which is a shame, since pretty much anyone who does pick up and play Pikmin tends to enjoy it without reservation, which points to its general obscurity as more of the culprit behind its lesser popularity. But, with Mr. Miyamoto as the godfather to the series, I'm sure we'll hear from this promising little game again at some point on ChronCube.